Hey folks, as much as I love playing with the latest and greatest tech, there's always something really special about the budget end of the scale. And budget is certainly what we're looking at today, in the form of this X79 Xeon bundle from AliExpress. For 55 of my great British pounds, that's 15 quid less than a couple of Corsair LL140 fans, and a wait of 2 weeks, I received a package containing this Micro ATX motherboard, with an IO shield, 2 4GB sticks of RAM, and a 6-core 12-thread Xeon processor, an E5-2620. Now the motherboard itself is a fairly interesting affair, a fairly basic but kinda capable VRM, 1 SATA 3 port, 3 SATA 2 ports, 1 full-sized PCIe Gen 3 slot for your graphics card, and a single PCIe by 1 slot for expansion cards. On each side of the CPU we've got space for 2 RAM sticks, although it doesn't run in quad channel, which is a shame. The most interesting feature though is the fact that it features an NVMe M.2 slot. Now this was not something that was originally really found on X79 motherboards, but what is really good to see is that it's actually able to max out my ADATA SX8200 Pro NVMe SSD. Obviously though, on the SATA side of things, with only 1 SATA 3 slot, you're going to want to make sure that any 2.5-inch SSDs are connected to that, but for any 7200 RPM mechanical drives, you're not even going to be getting close to maxing out the bandwidth available on SATA 2 for those. So all in all, with a bit of pre-thought, the board is probably going to be able to handle pretty much everything you can throw at it. So with that in mind, I've put together a little system with 2 configurations. In one of my favourite Micro ATX cases, the GameMax Stratos, which comes with a hinged glass side panel and 3 pre-installed fans. It's a really neat little case, we might take a look at it in another video, but it comes pretty feature rich for the price of 60 quid here in the UK. So first up we've got an out of the box configuration. That's 8GB of RAM, the E5-2620 6-core 12-thread Sandy Bridge CPU, which features a base clock of 2GHz and a boost clock of 2.5. The second configuration is going to be jumping over to Ivy Bridge using an E5-1650V2. Now this is a bit of a special CPU, it's basically a K-SKU Xeon, which means it comes unlocked. From the factory it comes with a 3.9GHz boost clock and a 3.5GHz base clock. In this configuration though, because it's unlocked and because this X79 board from AliExpress allows you to overclock, I've overclocked it to 4.2GHz across all 6 cores using Intel's Extreme Tuning utility. In this config too, I've also bumped up the amount of RAM to 16GB. Now the board can easily use ECC memory, which is on sale on eBay by the boatload, so for a really low outlay you can easily double the amount of RAM you're using in your system. If you're wondering about temps though, I can easily say that the IDOS tower cooler does a fantastic job in cooling everything, and even in the overclocked 4.2GHz configuration, temperature didn't go above 70 degrees C when running through a CineBench stress test. On the note of CineBench, it's probably a good place to start, and when we compare the scores of the 2620 and the E5-1650V2, we can see although on the surface they're both 6-core 12-thread processors, the performance gap is surprisingly huge. And while the 2620 it kinda falls pretty far behind any sort of modern CPU, the overclocked 1650V2 offers up performance on par in this test at least with something like the i5-8400 and just a little bit less than a 1st gen Ryzen 5 1600. Now when it comes to gaming, I wanted to pair the backbone of this system with something that is realistically priced. Now after writing this script, I actually moved on the E5-2620 and the 8GB of RAM that it came with on eBay, so that meant that my outlay for the X79 motherboard, the E5-1650V2 and the matched 16GB set of RAM came in at only £97 in total. Now I decided that this was also going to be my limit for the maximum price I would pay for a graphics card, and while I would have loved to use something like an RX 570, which in mid-2020 would have been easily achievable, the GPU shortage of 2020 has kinda rumbled into 2021, meaning the best I could do for that price was a GTX 1050Ti. So it's not as powerful as I'd have liked, but you're going to see that even with this lower spec card, we can still bottleneck it using the E5-2620. So onto the games. Shadow of the Tomb Raider was run at both 720p and 1080p on the medium preset. Now I like the built-in benchmark in this game as it gives a good indication of how CPU bottlenecked you are through its GPU utilisation metric at the end of the test. We'll start off with 1080p here, and regardless if you're using the E5-2620 or the 1650V2, the results were about the same, 39 FPS on average. Dropping down to 720p where the CPU is working much harder as the frame rates jump up, exposes just how on that knife edge you are, even when using a 1050 Ti, when you're using the 2620. Here the 1650V2 returns over 12% better performance in terms of average FPS, but more importantly we see that even in the built-in benchmark, we're actually CPU constrained, and the 2620 is bottlenecking the GTX 1050Ti for over 60% of the time. Far Cry New Dawn is a bit less multi-threaded than Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and because of that fact, the gap between the 2620 and the 1650V2 was evident to an even greater extent. At 720p, the 1650V2 returns an average FPS over 40% better than when using the 2620, and the 1% low results while using the 1650V2 is also over 20% better. Now, while you would expect that things would kind of even out at 1080p when we're pushing the focus back onto the GPU, that was not the case in Far Cry New Dawn. There's still a very noticeable gap, with the 1650V2 returning an average FPS which was 10% higher, and more importantly, the 1% lows at 1080p were higher on the 1650V2 to the tune of over 20%. This theme was repeated again in Assassin's Creed Valhalla. At 720p we see a gap of over 16% when it comes to average frame rate, and the 1650V2 pulls ahead to the tune of over 30% when it comes to 1% lows. At 1080p a single frame separates the CPUs in regards to average FPS, but there is again a really noticeable 24% difference in 1% lows. And that is the difference between playing at a locked 1080p 30fps or not. So I think it's probably fairly clear at this point that the bundled E5-2620 Xeon CPU is not really cutting the mustard in AAA titles, even when paired with a graphics card as lowly as a GTX 1050Ti. It's bottlenecking that card quite severely in some instances, while the 1650 just powers on. Now, the prices for the 1650V2 do tend to fluctuate quite wildly, simply because it is overclockable and one of the most desirable Xeon CPUs that fit in the X79 platform. But I managed to pick it up for 43 quid, and although that is pretty steep when you consider the original bundle in its entirety only cost 55 quid, but it really is the difference between having an interesting system and a system that is genuinely usable. So in my opinion, the 1650V2, if you're going to be sticking on the X79 platform, is definitely worth the outlay. Should you even be going down this route though? Well, compared to a used build using a Ryzen 5 1600, the cheapest B450 board on eBay that I could find, and 16 gigs of the most generic looking DDR4 that you've ever seen, well, it still came in at about half the price. It's as simple as that. You do lose any sort of upgradability though, so the 1650V2 is reasonably as good as it's going to get for gaming performance on this platform. But if you're on a real shoestring budget, and if there's no prospect of you being able to find that extra 100 to 150 quid to jump onto a modern platform, then the fact that you could get a 6-core 12-thread system with 16 gigs of dual channel RAM and an entry-level graphics card for under 200 quid, well, that's nothing to be snuffed at during a period of ever-increasing prices for components. And that's really the gist of this system. It's not going to be for everybody, but if it is your price range, then you could do a lot worse. But hey, I would love to know what you think of the budget X79 platform in 2021. Would you be willing to take the pitfalls of these older Xeon CPUs in exchange for a pretty decent bang per buck? Or does the lure of a first gen Ryzen, for that little bit extra, just pull too strong? I'll leave it there for today, but would love to know what you think of these bundles, and if any of you have actually bought one. I've been running this system for a good 2 months now, and there's been no issues with it whatsoever. But I would love to know your experiences when it comes to these unbranded Xeon bundles. For now though, I'll just say take care, and I'll see you all in the comment section down below, and in the next video.